Now, in a significant development, Russia has said that it is open to negotiations on an end to the Ukraine war if it is initiated by US President-elect Donald Trump. Now, Moscow's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva said that any talks need to be based on the realities of the Russian advances. These remarks have come in the wake of the indications of a shift in Ukraine's stand as well. And officials have said that Kiev's stance ahead may hinge not so much on territorial boundaries now as assurances and guarantees to make a ceasefire hold. And our next poll gets more details.
For months on end, Volodymyr Zelensky has reiterated that any peace settlement that amounts to ceding territory to Russia is not acceptable. That could be on the verge of changing. Quoting from the chairman of the Defense and Intelligence Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, talks should be based on guarantees for Ukraine. Nothing is more important. Another senior Ukrainian official said the territorial question is extremely important, but it is still the second question. The first question is security guarantees. What's led to the change of heart? Well, most obviously, realities, both on the ground and geopolitically. In the war zone, Ukraine faces big losses on the Eastern Front and in Kursk region of Russia. A bigger one perhaps though is US President-elect Donald Trump pushing for a quote-unquote accelerated timetable of negotiations. Trump has indicated he may soon appoint a special envoy to lead negotiations on ending the war. Plans have pointed at freezing the front lines along the current war zone, establishing a demilitarized zone and implementing a 20-year moratorium on Ukraine's NATO membership that Russia has demanded. As a justification for agreeing to any settlement, Kyiv has said it would not formally renounce any claim over territory under Russian occupation. Ukraine is skeptical of ceasefires after Russia violated them in 2014 and 2015. It seeks to ensure that any new one is foolproof. But support for ceding territory now in exchange for peace is rising among Ukrainians. Analysts say securing a favorable settlement for Ukraine while Russia is advancing would be extremely difficult. Russian negotiators would be unlikely to settle only for territory their army has already taken. One report said if the Ukrainians are driven from Kursk, Russia could accept a ceasefire along the front line by next spring. Territory set aside, security guarantees turn supreme. How realistic is that? Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
All right, now for more insights on this, we're being joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's a military expert and also the host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube, and is joining us live on this broadcast. Colonel, let me in fact start off by asking you this. What do you make of this latest statement by the Russians where they say that if negotiations were to be initiated by Donald Trump, and if the reality of the amount of territory that has been captured by Russia in this war is something that is accepted, then Russia is willing to sit down for negotiations? What, in your assessment, is Russia trying to hint at?
Well, listen, I think that they're just continuing with the very consistent theme they've said almost throughout the war, and then going back even to June 15th when Putin himself laid out very specific requirements for how the war could be brought to an end. He said in the wake of Trump's election just a week ago that he again would be willing to sit down and talk. But every time they do, they also say it has to reflect ground truth reality. And it's ironic that you have people on the Ukraine side saying, you know, they don't have a lot of trust in what the Russians would do. The Russians also have very little trust in what the Ukraine and the Western side would do. In their view, the negotiations that were reached on the Minsk agreements were violated by the West, were never intended to be solved. And so now then they're saying, how would we trust them in the future? I think what you're going to see is that Putin is going to say, I'm willing to talk, I'm willing to have negotiations to end this, but only on terms that I think are acceptable. And if those terms are not acceptable, I think he'll just continue the war until he conquers on the battlefield what he thinks is successful. And I think at a very minimum, that's going to be the entirety of all four of those oblasts that they annexed in 2022.
Interesting. Now, do you think this proposal that is being put forth, that if security guarantees were to be given to Ukraine, then Ukraine would be willing to cede the land that Russia has captured so far, which is 20% of the Ukrainian territory? For the leaders in Kiev, do you think this would be acceptable?
I mean, they may not have much of a choice in the matter. And the question is, who's going to provide those security guarantees? I can't think of any Western power that's going to be willing to say they'll go to war with Russia if the fighting gets renewed at some point in the future. So I think probably the best that you're going to see is some sort of unspecific, sort of categorical declaration by anybody in the West, to include the United States, that would say, we're interested in your security and, we'll do this, especially with something like the EU. But NATO, it's going to have to be off the table. And I don't think that other than the territory, I think that's another non-negotiable for the Russian side. There has to be a declaration of no future NATO. And I'm not even sure that thing that was floated a week or so ago, maybe in 20 years they'll renegotiate it. I don't know. I doubt that would be successful. But the bottom line is that the Russian side is in the driver's seat and has most of the cards.
Right. Russia is in the driver's seat, as you say. Now, Donald Trump, all through his campaigning, had said that he can end this war. He's in fact said that he can end this war in a day. In your assessment, what do you think would be Donald Trump's plan of action would be to try and bring an end to the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I obviously I think that's hyperbole in a day, but he certainly can start the process in a day. And I've been talking to some of his senior advisors on his transition team, on Trump's transition team, and they say his primary objective is to immediately get the killing stopped. Stop the war first, and then over time they can worry about the negotiations, because his priority is to stop a lot of the Ukrainian people from dying anymore in a pointless war, losing any more territory than is necessary, and all of that starts with a ceasefire. So I suspect that probably once he gets in office, that's going to predominate, because if you don't get a ceasefire, then it's hard to do any negotiations after that. So I think that probably would be his first move.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Davis, for joining us with that perspective then.
Always my pleasure.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.